You've heard about aliens making peaceful contact or mysterious lights hovering in the distance, but nothing prepared two Swedish workers for the night when extraterrestrial blobs launched a coordinated attack, trying to drag them aboard a glowing spacecraft while they fought desperately for their lives. These weren't little green men. They were gelatinous horrors that smelled like death and absorbed every punch like liquid nightmare fuel. December 20th, 1958. The clock had just struck 3 a.m. as a thick fog rolled across the Swedish countryside near the small village of Domston, located in the Kristianstad region of southern Sweden. The winter night was bitterly cold, with frost coating the pine trees that lined the narrow country road. 2 young men were making their way home after what had been an enjoyable evening of dancing and socializing in the nearby town of Höganäs. Stig Rudberg, a 30-year-old factory worker, sat behind the wheel of his friend's DKW Kombi automobile. Beside him was Hans Gustafsson, 24, who worked alongside Rydberg at his mother's laundry establishment on Långvinkelsgatan in Helsingborg. The 2 men had become close friends through their daily work together, and tonight they had decided to celebrate the approaching Christmas holidays with their girlfriends. Their evening had begun routinely enough. After finishing their work shift, they had driven the 12 miles to Höganäs to pick up 2 female companions for what the Swedes called a tur I bilen, a leisurely drive through the countryside. They had spent hours driving through the scenic winter landscape, stopping occasionally to buy food from roadside vendors, enjoying the simple pleasures of youth and friendship. At 2:30 a.m. they had dropped off their dates back in Höganäs and begun the journey home to Helsingborg. Both men were in good spirits, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before another day of work. The fog had grown increasingly thick as they drove, forcing Rydberg to reduce his speed to a crawl as visibility dropped to mere meters ahead of their vehicle. It was then that they first noticed the strange glow. Through the dense fog, approximately 150 feet into the forest, an unusual light was emanating from between the trees. At first, both men assumed it might be a campfire, though camping was prohibited in this area during the winter months. The light had an odd quality, not the warm, flickering orange of a wood fire, but something more consistent and somehow unnatural. According to witness reports, curiosity got the better of them. Rydberg pulled the car to the side of the empty road, and both men stepped out into the frigid night air to investigate. As they walked toward the source of the illumination, crunching through the frost-covered undergrowth, they could see that the light was definitely not a fire. What they discovered in that forest clearing would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Standing among the pine trees was a luminous, disc-shaped object, roughly 16 feet in diameter and about 3 feet in height. The craft appeared to be constructed of some self-illuminating material that cast an eerie glow across the surrounding forest without producing any warmth. Most remarkably, the object rested on 3 slender metallic legs that formed a perfect tripod, elevating it slightly above the frozen ground. Gustafsson would later describe the craft to investigators. "We saw a strange disc. It was resting on legs about 2 feet long. It seemed to be made of a peculiar, shimmering light that changed color. The object's surface appeared to shift and pulse with different hues, creating an almost hypnotic effect in the winter darkness." Both men stood transfixed by the impossible sight before them. In 1958, UFO reports were still relatively rare in Sweden, and neither man had any frame of reference for what they were witnessing. The craft made no sound, emitted no exhaust or vapor, and showed no obvious signs of technology they could recognize. Then they saw the creatures. Moving around the base of the craft were 3 to 4 entities unlike anything in earthly experience. The beings were approximately 4 feet tall and roughly 18 inches wide, but their most disturbing characteristic was their complete lack of fixed form. Witnesses described them as resembling globs of animated jelly, or living blobs of protoplasm that could change shape at will. The creatures were bluish-gray in color, with a gelatinous, translucent quality that made them appear both solid and liquid simultaneously. They moved by undulating across the ground, sometimes appearing to levitate slightly above the surface. Most unsettling of all, they emitted a nauseating odor that both men would never forget, a combination of industrial ether and burnt sausages that seemed to permeate the cold air. Rydberg later told investigators, "They were like protozoa, just a bit darker than most, sort of a bluish color, hopping and jumping around the saucer like globs of animated jelly." For several moments, both men remained frozen in place, their minds struggling to process the impossible scene before them. The blob-like entities were engaged in some activity around their craft, moving with purpose despite their bizarre, fluid appearance. Then, without warning, the creatures noticed the two Swedish men. What happened next transformed a strange sighting into a life-or-death struggle. The gelatinous beings suddenly surged toward Gustafsson and Rydberg with surprising speed and agility. Despite their amorphous appearance, they moved with coordinated intelligence, surrounding the two men before either could react. The attack was unlike anything described in previous UFO encounters. The blob creatures didn't use weapons or technology. They used their own malleable bodies as instruments of capture. They surged onto and into both men, their gelatinous forms enveloping arms and legs with what Gustafsson described as a suction-like force. Both men immediately began fighting for their lives, throwing punches and trying to break free from their captors. But their physical resistance proved almost useless. Their fists simply sank into the creatures' bodies like punching thick liquid, having no apparent effect on the entity's ability to maintain their grip. The creatures' ultimate intention became terrifyingly clear as they began dragging both men toward the waiting spacecraft. Using their pseudopod-like appendages, they maintained an iron grip on their victims, while pulling them steadily across the forest floor toward the illuminated disk. Gustafsson found himself being pulled inexorably toward the craft, his arms and legs completely engulfed by the gelatinous entities. The smell of ether and burnt meat was overwhelming, and he could feel the creature's suction-like grip tightening around his limbs. Despite his desperate struggles, he was being drawn closer and closer to what he was certain would be his doom. Rydberg, meanwhile, was experiencing his own terrifying battle with the blob creatures. Multiple entities had attached themselves to his body, their gelatinous forms conforming to his shape while maintaining an unbreakable hold. He thrashed and fought desperately, but like his friend, found his efforts largely ineffective against these impossible opponents. It was then that desperation gave Rydberg the strength and clarity he needed to save both their lives. In a moment of inspiration born from sheer terror, Rydberg managed to wrench one arm free from his captors and began fighting his way back toward their parked automobile. The creatures pursued him, their blob-like forms undulating rapidly across the ground, but Rydberg's panic had given him a surge of adrenaline that allowed him to stay just ahead of his pursuers. Reaching the car, Rydberg dove through the open door and began pounding on the horn with his fist, creating a piercing, continuous blast that echoed through the forest. The effect on the creatures was immediate and dramatic. If you're finding this incredible true story from Sweden as compelling as we are, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real UFO encounters that will challenge everything you thought you knew. Share this video with anyone who's ever questioned what else might be out there in the darkness. The moment the car horn began blaring, all of the blob creatures immediately released their captives and began retreating toward their craft with remarkable speed. Gustafsson, who had been on the verge of being dragged into the disc-shaped object, suddenly found himself free as his captors abandoned him and fled. Both men watched in amazement as the gelatinous entities flowed back into their spacecraft through what appeared to be an opening in its underside. Within seconds, the craft began to rise from its tripod landing gear, hovering silently above the forest floor before accelerating westward and disappearing into the foggy night sky. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but its effects on both men would prove far more lasting than the brief duration might suggest. Gustafsson and Rydberg stood in the sudden silence of the forest, both in a state of profound shock. Their clothes were disheveled, their bodies ached from the struggle, and the nauseating smell of their attackers seemed to cling to them. Most disturbing of all, both men felt physically ill, as if the encounter had somehow contaminated them on a cellular level. They returned to their car in stunned silence and drove home without speaking. Both men were experiencing a mixture of physical symptoms and psychological trauma that would persist for days. They felt nauseated, weak, and deeply disturbed by what they had experienced. The smell of ether and burnt sausages seemed to linger in their nostrils, creating a constant reminder of their terrifying encounter. For 3 full days, neither man spoke of what had happened in the forest near Domston. They went about their daily routines at the laundry, but friends and family members noticed that both seemed unusually quiet, jumpy, and distracted. Gustafsson's mother, Anna Berggren, and his brother Bengt observed that Hans appeared to be suffering from some kind of trauma, though they couldn't determine the cause. The physical symptoms were undeniable. Both men bore visible bruises and marks on their arms and legs where the creatures had gripped them. Their eyes appeared reddened and irritated, and they complained of persistent nausea and fatigue. Most concerning of all, neither man had been able to sleep properly since the encounter, with both reporting nightmares and anxiety attacks. Finally, unable to bear the psychological burden any longer, the 2 men decided to reveal their incredible story. They chose to confess during breakfast at the Gustafsson family home, believing that sharing their experience with trusted family members might help them process the trauma. The initial reaction was exactly what they had feared. Anna Berggren later recalled, "I burst out laughing at Stig as he told it. Yes, we all did. Everything sounded so weird." The family's first instinct was to dismiss the story as an elaborate joke, or perhaps the result of too much drinking during their night out. However, the family's laughter quickly faded as they realized the profound distress both men were experiencing. Their obvious physical injuries, psychological trauma, and unwavering insistence on the truth of their account began to convince the family that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. Word of the encounter eventually reached the local newspaper, Helsingborgs Dagblad, which published an account of the incident. This publicity brought the case to the attention of Swedish military authorities, who launched an immediate and thorough investigation. What followed was one of the most comprehensive official investigations of a UFO encounter in Swedish history. For 12 continuous hours, both men were interrogated by a team that included officers from the Swedish defense staff, medical doctors, psychologists, and police officers. The interrogation was so thorough and intensive that it resembled a military debriefing more than a typical police interview. Throughout the grueling questioning, both Gustafsson and Rydberg maintained their story with remarkable consistency. They answered hundreds of questions about every detail of their encounter, from the time of night to the exact appearance of the creatures and their spacecraft. Despite the intense pressure and repeated attempts to find contradictions in their testimonies, both men never wavered from their original account. Most significantly, the witnesses offered to take their interrogators to the site of the encounter, which they did. At the location Gustafsson and Rydberg indicated, investigators found physical evidence that corroborated key elements of their story. 3 distinct impressions in the frozen ground formed a perfect triangle, exactly matching the tripod landing gear described by the witnesses. These markings were photographed and documented as part of the official investigation. The case attracted international attention when Danish officials requested to observe the interrogation process. The reason for Danish involvement was stunning. a Danish woman had recently reported a remarkably similar encounter with gelatinous, blob-like creatures. This parallel case suggested that the Domston incident might not be an isolated event, but part of a pattern of encounters with these unusual entities. Even more intriguing, British intelligence agencies also expressed interest in the case, either sending representatives to observe the investigation or requesting detailed reports from Swedish authorities. The level of international military and intelligence interest suggested that the Domston encounter was being taken very seriously at the highest levels of government. Despite the physical evidence, consistent witness testimonies, and obvious trauma experienced by both men, the Swedish military eventually declared the case a hoax. However, this official conclusion was controversial even within investigative circles, as no evidence was ever presented to support the hoax determination. UFO researcher Sven Schallin, who conducted extensive interviews with both witnesses, concluded that their testimonies were authentic. After careful analysis of their statements and behavior, he wrote, "Both men seemed sincere, and I don't think they had made the thing up. I'm sure they were in a state of shock when they came to me. Something must have frightened them." The aftermath of the Domston encounter continued to affect both men for months following the incident. Neither was able to immediately return to their normal work routine, as they continued to suffer from anxiety, sleep disturbances, and what would today be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Local residents in the Domston area had mixed reactions to the case. Some laughed off the story as the product of overactive imaginations or too much alcohol, while others took it more seriously. Matti Hapaniemi, a respected local farmer, vouched for both men's character, stating that he had known them since childhood and considered them to be honest, reliable individuals who were not prone to fabrication or attention-seeking behavior. The Domston case became one of the most celebrated UFO encounters in Swedish history, not only because of its bizarre details, but also because of the extensive official investigation and the consistency of the witness testimonies. The encounter introduced the concept of physically aggressive extraterrestrial beings to UFO literature, challenging the more common narrative of peaceful alien visitors or distant sightings. The creatures described at Domston were unlike any entities reported in previous UFO encounters. Their gelatinous, shape-shifting nature, their aggressive behavior, and their apparent vulnerability to sound, as demonstrated by their retreat when the car horn sounded, suggested a form of life that defied conventional understanding of biology or physics. Some researchers have speculated that the blob creatures might represent a form of extraterrestrial life based on entirely different biological principles than Earth organisms. Their ability to change shape at will, levitate above the ground, and maintain cohesion despite their fluid appearance suggested advanced control over matter and energy that human science could not explain. The timing of the encounter has also attracted attention from researchers. December 1958 was during the height of the Cold War, when both military and civilian authorities were particularly sensitive to unusual aerial phenomena. The fact that multiple intelligence agencies took an interest in the case suggests that it was viewed as potentially significant from a national security perspective. What makes the Domston encounter particularly haunting is not just the strangeness of the creatures themselves, but the very real terror experienced by two ordinary working men who simply wanted to investigate an unusual light in the forest. Their lives were forever changed by those 10 minutes of horror, marked by months of trauma and a story that would follow them for the rest of their days. The forest clearing near Domston remains today much as it was in 1958, a quiet patch of woodland where pine trees grow tall and winter fog still rolls in from the Baltic Sea. But for those who know its history, the location carries an invisible weight, a reminder that in the depths of the Swedish countryside, some encounters leave traces that time cannot erase. Whether the experience was a genuine contact with extraterrestrial life forms, an encounter with unknown earthly phenomena, or something else entirely, the mystery endures. The physical evidence was documented and photographed. The witness testimonies have never been recanted. The international intelligence interest has never been fully explained. If two respected working men could be so profoundly traumatized by something they encountered in those woods, what other mysteries might be waiting in the dark places of our world? What other truths might be hiding just beyond the edge of our understanding, in the space between what we know and what we dare to imagine? In the end, the Domston encounter forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality itself. Are we alone in the universe, or do we share it with intelligences so alien that they exist in forms we can barely comprehend? And if such beings do exist, what are their intentions toward humanity? The two men who fought for their lives against the blob creatures in that Swedish forest may never receive official vindication for their story, but their encounter remains one of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of aggressive alien contact ever recorded. In the annals of UFO history, the Domston horror stands as a chilling reminder that not all visitors from beyond our world come in peace. Disclaimer: this video is based on public reports, eyewitness testimonies, and speculative analysis. Some details remain unverified. All interpretations are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only.